Grief is a funny thing. It's not a straight line. For 2 years, it had been a fog I'd learned to navigate. Some days it was a thin mist, letting the sun of old memories shine through. Other days it was a thick, suffocating blanket, and the world felt cold and gray. My father, David, had died in a hiking accident. It was tragic, sudden, but in a way, it was the only way a man like him could have gone. He was an adventurer, a man who believed the world was meant to be climbed, explored, and conquered. A quiet end in a hospital bed was never on his map. He died as he lived, on the edge of the world. That was the story I told myself. It was the story we all told. It was the eulogy, the epitaph, the final heroic chapter. The final piece of letting go was his storage unit. For 2 years, my mother and I had paid the monthly bill, unable to face the task of dismantling the museum of his life. But the bill was a constant, painful reminder, and we finally agreed it was time. Mom couldn't do it, so the task fell to me. I stood before the roll-up metal door, the cold lock in my hand, feeling like an archaeologist about to break the seal on a tomb. The air that hit me when the door rattled open was a potent cocktail of dust, old canvas, and my father's specific scent, a mix of sawdust and old spice that clung to everything he owned. It was a punch to the gut. The unit was packed to the ceiling. Stacks of National Geographic magazines, ropes and climbing harnesses hanging from hooks, old camping gear, boxes of books on cartography and ancient civilizations. It was him, a 10 by 20 foot box of everything that made him my hero. I spent hours sorting through it all, creating piles. Keep, donate, trash. Each item was a memory. The worn leather jacket he wore on our first father-daughter road trip, the dog-eared copy of The Hobbit he'd read to me a dozen times. It was emotionally exhausting, a slow, methodical heartbreak. I was near the back of the unit, wrestling with a large, dusty duffel bag full of old sleeping bags, when I felt it, a hard rectangular shape deep inside. It was heavy, too heavy to be camping equipment. My curiosity piqued. I dragged the bag into the light and emptied its contents. Out tumbled 3 musty sleeping bags and a small metal lockbox. It was old, the kind you'd keep petty cash in, secured with a simple key lock. I didn't recognize it. Dad wasn't a man for secrets, or so I thought. I shook it. Something slid inside with a heavy, muffled thud. The key was nowhere to be found, of course, but my father had also taught me that every problem has a solution. After a few minutes of work with a screwdriver from his old toolbox, the lock popped open with a sad metallic sigh. I lifted the lid. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a box of old coins or forgotten keepsakes. On top was a passport. It wasn't his old, well-worn one filled with stamps from Nepal and Peru. This one was newer, the cover a crisp dark blue. The name on the front wasn't David Miller. It read Arthur Finch. I opened it, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. The picture was of my father. Older, yes. His hair was grayer, his face thinner and lined with a sadness I'd never seen before, but it was undeniably him. I flipped through the pages. They were mostly empty, except for one. A single entry stamp from Mexico, dated just 6 months ago. My mind refused to process what I was seeing. It had to be a joke, a fake, some kind of novelty item from one of his trips. But it felt real. The paper, the ink, the holographic seal. Beneath the passport was a driver's license for the state of Oregon, also for Arthur Finch, with the same haunting photo. There were bank statements for an account under that name showing small, regular cash withdrawals from an ATM in a town I'd never heard of, Jasper Creek, Oregon. Then I saw the last thing in the box, a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it with trembling hands. It was a map, hand-drawn in my father's familiar, precise script. It wasn't a map of a mountain trail or a lost city. It was a map of a small town with streets and landmarks. And on the edge of the town, a single house was circled in red ink, a thick, angry circle drawn with a heavy hand. I sank to the dusty concrete floor. The contents of the box spread around me. The air was thick, and I couldn't seem to get enough of it into my lungs. He was alive. The thought was a flare of pure, unadulterated joy that lasted for a single, beautiful second before it was extinguished by a tidal wave of cold, crushing reality. He was alive, which meant he hadn't died in an accident. He had left. He had planned it. He had created a new life, a new name, and he had let us believe he was dead. He had let my mother grieve herself sick. He had let me spend 2 years mourning a ghost. The hero I had eulogized was a liar. The tomb I was clearing out wasn't a tomb at all. It was just the discarded costume of a man who had decided he didn't want to be our father anymore. The grief I had carried for 2 years curdled into something I didn't recognize, something hot and sharp and utterly devastating. I looked at the map in my hand. It was a map to a house, a map to a ghost, a map to answers. And I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that I had to follow it. I couldn't tell my mother. The lie had almost destroyed her. The truth absolutely would. How could I tell her that the man she mourned was alive and well in Oregon living under a fake name? How could I explain that our entire tragedy was a carefully constructed fiction? Her heart was fragile enough as it was. This would shatter it beyond any repair. I couldn't tell the police either. I could already hear the conversation in my head. My father, who was declared legally dead 2 years ago, is actually alive, and I found a secret passport. They'd think I was having a breakdown, a grief-induced fantasy. No, I was alone in this. This secret was mine to carry, a heavy, jagged stone in my gut. I went home and hid the box in the back of my closet, under a pile of old sweaters. For days, I lived in a haze, going through the motions of my life while a storm raged inside me. Every memory of my father was now tainted. Was he thinking of his escape plan when he taught me how to tie a figure-8 knot? Was he already Arthur Finch in his mind when he walked me down the aisle at my wedding? The man I knew was a stranger, and the stranger had my father's face. The anger was a physical thing. It made my hands shake and my vision blur. But beneath the anger was a question, a single burning question that kept me awake at night. Why? My father wasn't a cruel man. He was kind, patient, and he had loved us. I was sure of it. Or had I been sure of it? The man who had raised me and the man who would fake his own death to abandon his family could not be the same person. Something was missing. There had to be a reason big enough to justify an act of such profound betrayal. The map was a constant temptation. Jasper Creek, Oregon. I looked it up online. It was a small, remote town nestled deep in the mountains, the kind of place people go to disappear. The bank statements for Arthur Finch showed a pattern. a withdrawal of a few $100s every Friday from the same ATM at the town's single grocery store. He was there. He had a routine. He was predictable. The decision to go was not a single clear choice. It was a slow surrender to the inevitable. The not knowing was eating me alive. I took a week off from work, telling my boss I needed to deal with a family matter, which wasn't entirely a lie. I told my mother I was going on a solo retreat to the coast, a chance to clear my head. She was happy for me, telling me that my father would have been proud of my independence. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The drive to Oregon was long and silent. I listened to the playlists my dad had made for our old road trips, but the songs that once brought comfort now felt like artifacts from a stranger's life. With every mile that passed, my anger and my hope fought a war in the passenger seat. Part of me wanted to find him and scream in his face. Another, smaller part of me just wanted to see him, to prove that the man in the passport photo was real. Jasper Creek was even smaller and more isolated than I had imagined. It was a single main street with a diner, a general store, a gas station, and a bar. It was surrounded by a dense, intimidating forest. This was a town that kept its secrets. I checked into the only motel, a small, rundown place on the edge of town, paying in cash. I couldn't risk leaving a paper trail. My plan, if you could call it that, was simple. Watch, wait, and listen. I spent the first day in the town diner nursing a single cup of coffee for hours. I listened to the conversations of the locals. They talked about timber prices, the weather, and high school sports. It was a tight-knit community. A stranger would be noticed. I needed to blend in. The next day, I dressed in hiking clothes, trying to look like a tourist exploring the nearby trails. I walked through the town, my heart pounding every time I saw a man of a certain age and build. On Friday, I sat in my car across from the general store, the location of the ATM. I waited. The hours crawled by. I watched people come and go, buying groceries, picking up mail. I was starting to think I had been wrong, that he was gone, that I had come all this way for nothing. Then I saw him. A man walked out of the store, a small bag of groceries in his hand. He was thinner than I remembered, and he walked with a slight limp I didn't recognize. He had a thick, graying beard and wore a flannel shirt and a worn baseball cap pulled down low. But it was him. It was the eyes. I would know my father's eyes anywhere. They were the same sharp blue, but they were haunted, filled with a weariness that I had never seen before. He didn't look like an adventurer anymore. He looked like a man who was hiding. He got into an old, beat-up pickup truck and drove away. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely turn the key in the ignition. I followed him at a distance, my heart a frantic bird in my chest. He drove out of town, down a winding dirt road that led deeper into the forest. He pulled up to a small, secluded cabin, the same one from the hand-drawn map. A thin plume of smoke rose from the chimney. The mailbox at the end of the driveway was painted with a single name, A. Finch. It was all real. My father was alive, and he lived here. I parked my car down the road, hidden by a grove of trees, and I just watched the house. A house that shouldn't exist, where a man who should be dead was living a life I knew nothing about. What on earth was I supposed to do now? For a full day, I did nothing but watch. I sat in my car, eating stale granola bars and drinking lukewarm water, my eyes fixed on the small cabin. It felt like I was watching a nature documentary about a creature I didn't understand. I saw him chop wood, his movements methodical and practiced. I saw him sit on the porch, reading a book, a lonely figure against the vast, silent wilderness. This quiet, solitary man was a universe away from the vibrant, charismatic father who used to fill every room he entered. This was Arthur Finch, and I had no idea who he was. The anger I had felt was being complicated by a confusing wave of pity. He looked broken. Whatever he was running from, it had cost him everything. The question of why grew louder and more urgent with every passing hour. I couldn't leave without an answer. I couldn't go back to my life, to my mother carrying this half-truth. I had to know.
I decided to approach him at dusk. The setting sun cast long, eerie shadows through the trees, and a cold mountain wind began to blow. My nerve was a flickering candle flame, threatening to go out with every step I took up the long dirt driveway. The cabin looked smaller and more desolate up close. I could see him through the front window, sitting at a small wooden table, staring into a cup of coffee. He looked like the loneliest man in the world. I raised my hand to knock, and for a moment I hesitated. What if he denied it? What if he turned me away? What if the truth was worse than anything I could imagine? I took a deep breath and knocked. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silence of the woods. I saw his head snap up. He froze, listening. I knocked again, harder this time. He moved slowly, cautiously to the door. He peered through a small peephole. I saw the flash of his eye, and then he recoiled, as if he'd been struck. I heard a muffled curse from inside. For a long moment, nothing happened. I thought he might not open the door, that he would leave me standing on his porch in the growing darkness. Then I heard the sound of a deadbolt sliding back. The door creaked open, and he stood before me. It was him. The beard, the tired eyes, the haunted expression, it couldn't hide the face I knew better than my own. He stared at me, and his face was a canvas of conflicting emotions. There was no shock, no surprise, only a deep, profound sadness and a weary resignation. It wasn't the face of a man caught in a lie. It was the face of a man whose time had finally run out. "I knew this day would come," he said, his voice raspy, unused. It was my father's voice, but stripped of all its warmth and vitality. "How did you find me?" "The storage unit," I said, my own voice tight, barely a whisper. "You left a map." He let out a short, bitter laugh. "Careless," he muttered to himself. "After all that planning, I got careless." He looked at me, really looked at me then, and I saw a flicker of the father I remembered in his tired eyes. "You shouldn't be here, Anna. It's not safe." "Not safe?" My voice cracked, the anger finally bubbling to the surface. "You let us think you were dead for 2 years. You let Mom fall apart. You let me grieve for nothing. Don't you dare talk to me about safety." He flinched at the anger in my voice but didn't argue. He just sighed, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. "Come inside, Anna," he said, stepping back from the door. "You deserve an explanation." The inside of the cabin was sparse and functional. A bed, a table, a small kitchenette, a single bookshelf. It was the room of a man who wasn't living, but merely existing. He motioned for me to sit at the table, and he poured me a cup of coffee without asking. His hands shook slightly. He sat across from me, not looking at me, but at his own gnarled hands wrapped around his mug. "I never wanted to hurt you or your mother," he began, his voice low. "Everything I did to protect you." "Protect us from what?" I shot back. "By pretending to be dead?" "Yes," he said, finally meeting my gaze. His eyes were clear and filled with a pain that silenced me. "Exactly that." And then he told me the story. The real story. My father, the adventurer and small business owner, had made a mistake. A few years before his death, his construction business had hit a rough patch. He was on the verge of bankruptcy. Desperate not to lose everything he had built, not to fail his family, he took a loan. But it wasn't from a bank, it was from a man, a private investor that he was recommended. This man was charming, helpful, and had the money available immediately. He thought he was saved. But the investor wasn't just an investor, he was connected. The money wasn't clean, and the interest rates were impossible. When my dad couldn't keep up with the payments, the charm disappeared. The threats started. Subtle at first, then more direct. They knew where we lived. They knew my mother's schedule. They knew where I worked. They made it clear that if he didn't pay, they wouldn't just take his business, they would take everything. They would come after us. He went to the police, but they couldn't do much. These were dangerous, careful people who operated in the shadows. My dad was trapped. He sold assets, he borrowed more, he dug the hole deeper, but he could never get out. He realized they would never let him go. He was a resource they would bleed dry, and when he was empty, they would hurt his family as a warning to others. He saw only one way out, he said, his voice thick with shame. One way to make them stop. If I disappeared, they'd still come looking for you, trying to get to my assets. But if I died, The debt dies with me. An accident, clean and final. There would be nothing left for them to chase. You and your mother would be safe. They wouldn't waste their time on a grieving widow and daughter. The hiking accident was his escape plan. He meticulously planned it for months. He made it look real, leaving just enough evidence for search and rescue to conclude he had fallen. And then he vanished, becoming Arthur Finch, a ghost, hiding in this remote corner of the world, living on the small amount of cash he had managed to squirrel away. Every single day for the past 2 years, he said, his voice breaking, I've woken up and my first thought is of you and your mother. I have a secret email account I use to read the local news from our hometown. I see your pictures on your friends' social media. I saw your promotion at work. I saw your mother starting her book club again. He pointed to a small, locked chest in the corner. I've written you a letter every single week since I left. Letters I knew I could never send. He wasn't a monster who had abandoned us. He was a man who had amputated a part of his own soul to save us. The story was so unbelievable, so insane, that it had to be true. The anger that had fueled me for days finally dissolved, leaving behind a hollow, aching sadness. He wasn't a liar I had come to confront. He was my father, and he was in more pain than I could ever have imagined. You have to go, Anna, he said, his voice firm again. You can't come back. If anyone followed you, if anyone connects Arthur Finch to David Miller, then all of this was for nothing. The danger is still out there. We sat in silence for a long time. The chasm between us was filled with 2 years of lies, grief, and unspoken words. I had found my father, but I was going to have to lose him again. The drive back was a blur. My mind was a mess of conflicting emotions. The anger was gone, replaced with a profound, gut-wrenching sorrow. I had found my father only to understand that he had to remain a ghost. The lie he had built was a shield, protecting my mother and me, and my discovery had put a crack in it. He was right. I could never go back. I could never tell anyone. His secret was now my secret. His prison was now mine. When I got home, my mother hugged me, asking about my retreat. I told her it was just what I needed. I looked at her, truly looked at her for the first time in 2 years. She was healing. She was smiling again. She was building a new life on the foundations of a heroic tragedy. Telling her the truth would be an act of unimaginable cruelty. It would burn down the little piece she had managed to find. So I smiled back, and the lie felt like ash in my mouth. My life is now divided into a before and after. Before, I grieved a dead hero. Now I carried the heavy truth of a living man who sacrificed his life to save us. I sometimes look at the map, which I keep hidden in the back of my closet with the other contents of the box. It's a map to a man I can never see again. A father who was both alive and gone forever. The world is full of secrets, hidden in dusty boxes and remote cabins. I learned that the stories we tell ourselves to survive are sometimes more important than the truth. My father died in a hiking accident 2 years ago. He was a hero, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure that's the only story anyone ever knows. The stories we think we know are often just the surface of a much deeper truth. Secrets, lies, and the desperate choices people make for family can change everything in an instant. If this story made you think, or if you've ever uncovered a secret that changed your world, please share this video. You never know who might be carrying a similar burden. For more stories that explore the hidden truths behind ordinary lives, make sure to subscribe and click the bell. Thank you for listening.